This is a response to genetically modified skeptics, the arguments for God's existence tier list. I know it has been several years since that video was posted, but hey, I'm slow, and I do other things too. I'm not a full-time YouTuber. I do business accounting and recreational math and watch a lot of pro wrestling too. Plus, I didn't feel called to do a response until recently. I wonder when the skeptic initially felt called to make his video before he made it. Oh well, no matter. In organizing this list, I define God to be an entity that intentionally created all of nature. That's the simplest definition I can think of that would constitute God. Some people believe there is a God that intentionally created nature, but they add other traits to him like omnipotence, benevolence, etc. Of course, the more traits you say God must possess for him to be God, the easier he will be to argue against. So any argument that gets a good grade in this particular tier list will get a good or better grade in any type of argument against God tier list that someone would imagine pretty much. Since I'm biased and consider certain read text to be sacred, I'll probably argue much more against each argument I bring up than I will argue for it. But I certainly can't claim I've solved everything or debunked every doubt. I'm not near that foolish. I would not expect to change one person's mind no matter how much I talk about this stuff. And some things I can't really argue against at all. I actually have a STEM degree, believe it or not. I just couldn't get my formal credentials beyond the bachelor level, although I do try to stretch my abilities as far as they can go, even to the point where I embarrass myself with incompetence from time to time. And of course, I'm sure I didn't assemble this tier list in a 100% rational manner. Perhaps some arguments should have been placed higher or lower. Maybe there's a law similar to Arrow's impossibility theorem that would demonstrate that there is no way to construct a tier list like this in a rational manner. In any case, I don't worry about appearing irrational or making an error here and there, because I'd argue that all believers and all non-believers possess at least some level of irrationality. Who's rational all the time? No one I've ever heard of. You realize how difficult that would be? Notes from the Underground makes a good case for that, about how irrational mankind overall is, and how far a man is from following a logical path. Do you carefully test every bridge before you cross it? Or do you have to take some crossings on faith simply because testing everything takes too darn long? As far as the tier list goes, the first argument I'll examine is logically incorrect, so we'll start with that. No proof of God, so he can't exist. Grade of F. If someone says they don't believe because there's not enough evidence, that's one thing. But if they say it's an impossible scenario because there's no proof, they need to be aware of unproven open problems in mathematics like the Riemann hypothesis or the Collatz conjecture. You can't claim that these two things are false because they're not proven. And you can't say they're true simply because there's tons of evidence for them. Skews' number showed that even when you have a ton of evidence for something, there is the possibility of a distant but defined counterexample. There are also truths that will never be provable, according to the incompleteness theorems of Gödel. There's not always a yes or no answer. In computer science, the halting problem is undecidable, for instance. You can't get a yes or no answer for every single program to decide whether it halts or not. God is mean, so he can't exist. Grade of F. Even if God can be considered cruel, that's hardly an argument for believing he's not real. Existence has no correlation with kindness. It's a logically inaccurate statement to say that everything that exists must be good. According to that friendly atheist YouTube channel, Satan in the Bible killed, what, 10 people? No telling how many he lied to. And God killed between 3 and 25 million? But neither of those numbers even comes close to comparing with how many nature killed, because it has killed every person and every creature that ever lived and will continue to do so. And nature is definitely a reality you can't argue with, no matter how cruel it seems. A smart person can't believe in something as dumb as religion. Grade of F. Too many examples of smart, scientifically minded people who believed and didn't believe throughout history and even today. Not to mention those who were brilliant both before and after switching their belief system. Then we have guys like Augustus de Morgan and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle who believed in stuff like seances. Might seem silly, but I guarantee these guys weren't stupid. I have respect, admiration, and love for the work and contributions to humanity of an overwhelming number of believers and non-believers. I will mention more examples in later sections, but Wikipedia has limited lists for anyone interested. I will say that I am greatly disturbed by the ignorance of people who believe their ability to work a smartphone designed to be user-friendly considers anyone who lived before the color TV era to be stupid, when the person with that smartphone probably has no clue how the electronics in that phone work. There were people in the 1840s who knew more about electricity than any modern idiot with enough hubris to possess a belief like that. If they're anything like me, they probably are still puzzled about the workings of LC circuits, or most likely have never heard of them. Religion is outdated and science will replace it. Grade of D. Religion can, in theory, be replaced by philosophy, but not by science. Science detects facts, not values. Secularist David Hume realized the fact-value distinction. You can't get an ought from an is. Religion and philosophy deal with moral values. Science does not and never will. Science can tell you what the facts are, but cannot tell you which facts are important and worthy of pursuit. That's why you can do some really evil scientific experiments that obey every law of science and violate every law of morality. Religion and philosophy are not good at discovering how electricity works, and science is not good at explaining why earthquakes that destroy cities are unfortunate events. Science has no standardized units for morality. Religion is holding back progress. Grade of D. At one point, beliefs stemming from religion certainly did hold back a great amount of scientific thought, particularly with planetary motion. But as science as we currently know it was beginning to take shape, religious astronomers and scientists actually drove a lot of progress. Robert Boyle, for example. Kepler and Newton as well. Michael Faraday made huge advances in electricity as a very religious man. Most of America was religious when airplanes and TV were invented. How much more progress do you want than that? Religion sometimes stifled scientific progress, and other times it enhanced it. The same can be said of Aristotle's works. You can't just claim the stifling and ignore the enhancement, unless you only care about partial truth. Right now, progress is advancing extremely fast. I don't get why it's considered by anybody to be not fast enough. I remember being pretty happy before the internet came along, and not painfully yearning for more progress in communication at the time. Plus, if you haven't figured it out by now, progress usually creates certain problems as it solves other problems. No sense in rushing to fix every problem you know of if it will just create more problems you don't know of in the future. Like I say often, the best way to fix global warming is to go back to Amish technology. Believers were horrible to me and made me not believe in God anymore. Grade of D. Personal experiences that shape opinions certainly don't shape reality as a whole, but you can definitely sympathize with anyone who has had a bad experience with people who hurt their feelings. I had parents that were believers, and they were super great to me. Best parents anyone could ever want. No doubt that influenced me in some way. Morality is socially constructed, made by man, and not a deity or anything else. Grade of C. As far as I can tell, there are three positions on morality: moral nihilism, moral relativism, and objective morality. But I've always considered moral relativism to be ridiculously flawed. Does it imply that one must abide by the morals of the geographic area and time period? That would imply there's at least one objective moral law that you must abide by. And if you have just one absolute moral law, you believe objective morality exists, one created by something other than collective humanity. Because how can a collective humanity, with its constant rotation of individuals over time, claim to create something absolute and unchanging? Moral relativism contains such a large minefield of pitfalls to justify that it makes all of the magical stuff religious people have to justify look small by comparison. So we're left with moral nihilism and objective morality, and it seems the secular community is divided on this. I've seen very few people admit to being moral nihilists, though. Much of the secular community tends to believe that it's inherently wrong, regardless of geographic location or time period, to make up fairy tales to scare people into being good. The very few open moral nihilists out there that realize the pursuit of truth is a personal preference for them rather than a universal requirement can certainly make a good argument that morality is socially constructed, thus making a deity-driven morality easily questionable. But those that argue that knowingly creating a false religious doctrine is inherently wrong, well, they're going to have a big problem using the argument that morality is socially constructed when they sure act like part of it isn't. The Bible is scientifically inaccurate. Other religious texts may be also. Grade of C. While it's certainly true that the biblical Genesis creation story is very inaccurate according to the scientific community and goes against our collective scholastic deductive reasoning immensely, it's a very short part of the text that does not capture the text's intention whatsoever. Arguing for or against evolution puts an insane amount of focus on 2 chapters of the Bible and ignores the 1,100 other chapters. It seems clear the purpose of the Bible is not to convince or educate anyone on the intricacies of how natural laws operate or how the planets move the way they do. The Bible serves a spiritual and moral purpose more than anything else, as do most religious texts. Most of the Bible is lamenting on how God's people broke his laws over and over again. That's the vast majority of the content. But even if you prove all parts of all religious texts are false, it still is not enough to disprove a God exists somewhere. It's just enough to claim more evidence for his existence as false. Why so many religions? Grade of C. Just because we don't know the complete nature of God and can't agree on it doesn't mean he can't exist. But it does again lead to the lack of evidence argument, which will be addressed later. Religion is a scam for people to make money. Grade of B. Still not enough on its own to prove God can't exist, but there definitely are a lot of religious scam artists out there. Atheists don't need God in order to be moral. Grade of B. Just because someone does or doesn't believe in God doesn't automatically make them bad, but it also doesn't automatically make them good either. If God is the creator, who created God? Grade of B. Very good argument, but no matter what, the origin of things is tricky. Either stuff showed up at one point out of nowhere, or it always existed. We'll never know. That's why we don't have a clue and can never prove if there was a big crunch before the Big Bang. We'll only have speculation and never evidence. We may get more evidence as we dig deeper, but we'll always have unanswered origin questions, I believe. Infinite regress issue. Magic doesn't exist. Grade of B. The supernatural is usually defined as a fairly rare occurrence that goes against the known laws of nature, sometimes directed by words or gestures that normally would accomplish a whole lot of nothing. Now, if we do not have an explanation of a phenomenon, we call it a trick if we suspect it is not legitimate, or if we do think it's legitimate and we can repeatedly observe it, we call it an unexplained property of nature, or if we think it's simple enough, we just call it an inherent property of nature. Anything that's out of our control to repeatedly observe and test because it's too rare will always be considered unscientific. And anyone who will not accept anything outside the bounds of full acceptance from the scientific community will consider it untrue. Therefore, supernatural occurrences that are forever outside of our ability to reason will probably never be proven to our satisfaction, but they still might exist. Of course, once we can grasp something, initially very strange to us, to be able to control it, like electricity, it goes from mysterious and apparently supernatural to science. Reminds me of one of the 3 laws of Arthur C. Clarke. We can't consistently detect the supernatural without turning it into science. The minute we can control it, we don't consider it magic anymore. It becomes science. Every time an unexplained rare event occurs, if you ask a scientist, how long do we go on searching for a natural explanation of that event before we classify it as supernatural? The proper scientists would answer, forever. They'd never give up searching for a natural explanation of phenomena. That's not necessarily a bad thing, of course, but it does point out that magic has been pigeonholed into non-existence by definition in the scientific community. It's axiomatic that the supernatural doesn't exist, and that makes it pointless to argue any further. Even spontaneous human combustion is considered science and not magic now. It was never supernatural to begin with, and was always natural. We just weren't able to understand it earlier. Now that we know why people with 2 heads exist, and we call it polycephaly, we no longer consider it just fairy tale magic. And now that we can inefficiently create precious metals with the Seaborg technique, we no longer call it alchemy magic. I still think that a magnetic charge and an electric point charge having a perpendicular relationship is pretty darn magic. But it's repeatable, so it's considered scientific because we can control it. And we just explain it by saying it's an inherent property of nature. Perhaps there's a deeper explanation, but eventually we'll reach things that are just flat out inherent properties. I still wonder why light travels at a constant speed in all inertial reference frames, but nothing else does. It's a fundamental postulate for special relativity that yields a lot of weird counterintuitive stuff. I don't think we've yet found a deeper explanation, and instead of calling it magic or God's plan, we call it an inherent property of nature. I believe the double-slit experiment with electrons has a deeper scientific explanation behind it, and we will eventually find it, but we'll never have an answer to everything. Of course, one can argue that God can still exist even if he has none of the magic properties that are typically attributed to him. God can't be omnipotent because it's logically impossible. Grade of A. Logically, this is true. The omnipotence paradox is logically correct, and it pretty much establishes that no being can be omnipotent. You can't logically have an all-powerful being that can create something it's not powerful enough to lift. At least I don't think so. Of course, it's possible for a God to exist that's not all-powerful but still created all of nature. In any case, I'd argue that being unable to create something you can't lift is not much of an impediment to practical omnipotence. It's like thinking a function undefined at one point on the domain can't be useful. For all practical purposes, being able to control things like thunderstorms, earthquakes, animals, and things like that is pretty much omnipotent. I just like the omnipotence paradox because it's clever and logical, and that's why I rank it so high. But it doesn't have much practical value. We could also take the kamikaze approach and still affirm the statement of God's total omnipotence as true and say that logic itself is false. It may be cognitive dissonance at its finest. Dangerous to use that approach, but possible. But trying to use logic to argue that logic is false is not a good strategy and worthy of a grade of D or F. We can't prove logic is right, but if it's wrong, it sure takes away any other reliable tool we might have, even though Gödel's incompleteness theorem leaves that opening. I myself have stated before that truth is more inconsistent than lies, back when I wrote my G-rated shock value manifesto years ago. We can create meaning without God and can live as if he doesn't exist. Grade of A. Logically true. Someone has the option to do this. Hard to argue against from a logical, non-spiritual point of view. Plus, temporary meaning definitely has merit. I know if God did not give me eternal life and I had nothing after death but non-existence, I still should be grateful for the existence I had and enjoyed. At least I hope I would be grateful. I'm definitely not the poster child for what a great person is, and I am very likely to forget all the good someone did for me if I'm not careful. No physical evidence for God. Grade of A. A lot of previous arguments in this video might not have been all that good on their own, but combined together they start to add weight to this final argument here. Atheists are smart to keep things simple using Friar Occam's razor. If there is no evidence of something, then it's probably because it doesn't exist. An existent God definitely could make his presence more known than what we currently see in our universe. One isn't wrong in wondering why he isn't more overt. God definitely has a mysterious and subtle aura, enough to fool you that he may not be present. And why would he not desire to make himself more overt? Not an easy question to answer. I've always felt that he has been quite overt in my life, so I haven't had too many issues questioning his presence or existence. But I can understand how someone else might not have had such overt experiences. When people venture to start a business, or become an author or actress, or worse, to play the lottery, there often is a lot of evidence suggesting that they're fighting against the odds. And there certainly was a lot of evidence for a good while that no one would ever recognize Vincent van Gogh's name. No one had evidence when Barack Obama was 2 years old that he would be president someday. In almost any case where you make a future prediction that sides with the odds, you are being extremely rational. But your prediction may not come true. We live in a very strange world where truth and rationality do not always coincide. Hard to believe, but rational and true are most definitely not equivalent. That's a fact for sure. That's probably why quantum physics is so hard with the Copenhagen interpretation stuff and all that. And I think it's crazy that we were able to control the nuclear fission process, yet we still do not have a closed formula for the circumference of an ellipse, despite the formula for the area of an ellipse being so easy and simple. It's as if nature itself is irrational, not just human beings. To this date, we still cannot find magnetic monopoles, even though their existence would add a nice symmetry to Maxwell's equations. I do not know if we'll ever prove their existence, and if so, it makes you wonder why they'd be so rare. At one time, we had no evidence for time dilation and special relativity, and a lot of evidence against it, with just our very senses. And life experience can be quite strange and irrational as well, in good or bad ways. Paradoxes are more common than one would think. Like, why would euphoric substances that bring such apparent joy be so destructive to our bodies and souls? What's interesting is not only would I give the lack of evidence of God's existence in A, I would also give the presence of evidence of God's existence in A. Even genetically modified skeptics, the arguments for God's existence tier list gives the fine-tuning argument its highest rank. I think that's why this debate has gone on for centuries and perhaps millennia, because both sides make good points. In fact, the presence of evidence and lack of evidence may be the best argument that can be made from both sides. I'm not quite sure how to conclude this tier list, other than to mention that it took me quite a while to learn all the math and science material I used in my commentary. A lot of book reading over many years. Often I can only recall 2 or 3 things from a book for the long term after I've read it, and it only gets worse as I grow older and more frail. Just goes to show you, truth is expensive, if you haven't already figured that out. It eats up a lot of your time in pursuing it. And it's sad because both individually and collectively, our ignorance of the universe will always be far greater than our knowledge of it. Makes you think that all is vanity, which is the main topic of the book of Ecclesiastes. And of course, Ecclesiastes concludes with these words of wisdom, which I believe 100%. When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commandments, because this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, along with every hidden thing, whether good or evil. I hope that God and his true followers won't hold any of what I just said against me. I guess the worst case scenario is I can be like the Pharaoh of Ezekiel 32, taking comfort that even though he's in Sheol, he's there with the rulers of other warrior nations there. Only in my case, I'd be there with only the most sinful of villains, and I can at least tell the ones there that didn't believe, I told you so. In the words of country legend Bobby Bear, that makes me the winner.